Okay, it's 5 after, so I'm going to get started. My name is Lloyd McKenzie. I've been involved with FHIR since before it was called FHIR. I don't seem to have good sense in terms of what I do with my personal life, so I spend a great deal of time with the FHIR community, helping out implementers, designing implementation guides and various other things. But I have a long background with HL7. I've been involved with them for about 20 years. So I have a deep history with version 3 and CDA and everything that comes before. But pretty much all of my life these days is consumed with FHIR. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how to use FHIR in a way that delivers on its promise. I mean, we created FHIR to be fast, we created FHIR to be easy, we created FHIR to let developers get solutions up and running quickly. But the reality is we don't always get what the sales pitch is for FHIR when we introduce FHIR solutions. And some of that's because of just the way FHIR operates, that it tends to lead people sometimes to design solutions that are not necessarily going to be optimal for long-term benefit. And sometimes it's just because people don't know better, don't realize what FHIR could do if they designed their solutions a little bit differently. So hopefully coming out of today, you will have a better sense of how to design your particular FHIR implementation space to get what FHIR tries to deliver and realize that. Few things that we're going to try to accomplish. One is things to think about as part of designing your solutions. So when you are creating solutions, making sure that you're designing things for maximizing the benefit of FHIR, but also so that when you're reviewing implementation guides that others are designing, whether that's national programs or partners that you're working with, making sure that you can look at what they're proposing and identify whether it's going to cause you problems or whether it's going to not necessarily provide as much benefit as you were hoping for. And ideally, influence them before they sort of set things in stone and you have no choice but to do what they tell you to do. Nothing that we're going to talk about today is a situation where if you don't do what Lloyd says, you're not conformant. There are many different ways to be conformant with FHIR. Some ways are simply going to give you more implementation benefits and more powerful implementations than others. First thing is obviously one of the main differences that FHIR introduces from what HL7 had available before is that with FHIR you can use REST. And FHIR does not require the use of REST. You can also use documents, you can use messages, you can use services, you can do other things. And there are some people who think that the only way that you can do FHIR is REST, and that's not true. There are situations where you need to do those other things. But REST is really helpful. REST is helpful because it does not impose expectations, there we go, on how the system behavior is going to behave. You can speak to a REST interface independent of what your particular use case is. If a server exposes the ability to do search, it doesn't matter why you are searching. You can simply take advantage of whatever the search capabilities are. There aren't typically requirements to combine particular search parameters in particular ways. Data access with REST is also more granular. So you are picking the particular pieces of data that you care about. You don't necessarily have to package everything up together to solve a particular use case. With messaging or with documents, you're being provided with a whole set of information. But that set of information, because it's a collection, is going to be targeted at a single use case. If you have a different use case, then you need a different message, you need a different document design, and that means that there's a cost. Every time that there's a new set of requirements, you have to build a new interface to expose that message or expose that document. Whereas if you have a RESTful interface that says, I have encounters, I have allergies, I have medications, come grab whatever it is that you need, somebody with a new use case and who needs a new combination of information is free to leverage that existing interface and grab the set of information that they require. The other piece is that when it comes to messaging and documents, there's organization to the data. So in documents, you have sections, and you have to agree on what sort of information is going to be in what sections will exist. In messaging, you have to agree on what are your events, and what are the focuses for those events, and what are the allowed responses. When you fire off a message, what kinds of messages can come back. And you have to get agreement with all of the different parties who are going to be involved in the communication on what those exchanges are going to look like. So there's much more negotiation required to get a messaging interface up and running, or to get a document interface up and running, than a simple RESTful interface. And that doesn't mean that you can't use messaging and you can't use documents. Documents are, sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. I have to point it, that's why. Documents are going to be important if you need to have a single snapshot where the focus is human readability, and you want to make sure that the person looking at your lab results or looking at your pathology report is seeing exactly what the pathologist wrote or what the lab technician wrote. Then documents can certainly be relevant there. If you need to be able to sign the content and know that the system is storing exactly what you sent, that they can't throw certain pieces of information away, then documents might be necessary. But if you don't need that, then documents are going to be a bit of overhead. Certainly, there are lots of legacy solutions that are tied to CDA that use documents for sharing pretty much everything, because converting the data from documents to any other form simply wasn't possible in the CDA world. But in FHIR, you have the ability to access information as REST. So if you want to see what is the current list of patient medications, you could generate a document on the fly with that information, but you're going to be better off and have less overhead and less negotiation required if you just hit the patient medication statement resource or the medication request resource, or the set of resources that are relevant to the data that you happen to require. Messaging also has its place. If you need to have, it used to be if you needed asynchronous, although we now support asynchronous with a RESTful interface as well. But if you need indirect delivery, so the ability to send information to a recipient, but you don't know what their endpoint is, you need to rely on your existing messaging infrastructure where you talk to your interface engine, which talks to another interface engine, which talks to another interface engine, and eventually gets it there. Then messaging is still appropriate. Or if you're involved in a situation where, for whatever reason, the system that you're talking to can't query for the additional information that it might need, that you have to give it everything at once because it has no ability to go out and query for more, then messaging can be relevant. There's often reluctance in existing systems to the notion of they might have to go out and query for data. They're used to somebody sort of serving everything up on a silver platter and giving them whatever it is that they would like to have. But there's a cost for that, just like there's a cost in a restaurant where you sort of have somebody prepare your meal and give it to you on a silver platter. There's a cost to it in the interface world as well, and it's easier if you sort of have the REST buffet where you go up and line up in the buffet with everybody else and you pick the pieces that you want, and we don't have to customize for what it is that each particular individual wants to have. Messaging does also have one other capability, which is that you can invoke complex behaviors. We can do that as well with FHIR operations. The cost for both of those is pretty similar. You need to have negotiations, agree on what your input parameters are, agree on what your output parameters are, and have the server and the client agree that they're both going to support the operation. Whether they do that as a pure RESTful operation or they do that using messaging, the costs aren't really any different. So obviously, if it's a standard operation that HL7 has defined, you're going to see more interoperability there than if it's something that's local to your particular implementation space. Look for implementation guides to drive that kind of behavior. Anything that you're defining yourself as an individual hospital or organization, you're probably going to find challenges getting large numbers of stakeholders to support whatever it is that you're trying to do. Messaging may be a slight benefit there in that you can leverage existing infrastructure. Lots of systems know how to do messaging in general. And whereas defining a custom operation endpoint might be a little bit harder to get them to support. If you are already in a document environment or a messaging environment and you're looking to transition to REST, it is going to mean some changes to how you think about your data and how you expose your data. First of all, it means exposing your data for query. If you're a messaging interface and you're used to sort of pushing out your admit, discharge, transfer events, so new patient has been admitted, I send everything out to anybody who might care. You're not necessarily set up for somebody external to you to come in and say, give me the patient allergies or give me the patient insurance, because that's not how you behaved in the past. So it does mean a change to system function in terms of exposing interfaces and letting external systems come in and look at those. It also means a change to how your security model functions. In a messaging world, you could tie privileges to what event was happening. So you could give different access expectations, whether you were doing an admission or a discharge or a transfer or a leave of absence or return from leave of absence, that sort of thing. In FHIR, most of those things manifest as either I've created an encounter or I've updated an encounter or I've updated an encounter or I've updated an encounter, and it's not as straightforward to figure out exactly what's going on. You can build logic that looks at what was the previous state and what's the new state and infers what's going on in the real world, but that's complex and may not necessarily be straightforward. So in a RESTful space, it's much more natural to have security permissions based simply on, are you allowed to make updates, and are you allowed to update the specific elements that you've tried to change, and if so, then let it proceed, and if not, then don't. But not necessarily tying it to what are the business events that are happening. And so that's a change to your security model. One of the major reasons to look to expose a RESTful interface is that a lot of the services that build on top of FHIR, things like smart CDS hooks, bulk data, that sort of thing, only functions if you have a RESTful interface. You cannot build smart apps on top of messaging or CDS hooks, decision services on top of messaging. And those are pretty powerful technologies that there's a lot of interest in. And so certainly look to expose REST as much as you can within your interfaces. Second guideline is try to create permissive interfaces. What that means is that you shouldn't follow your instincts when you're designing FHIR solutions. When people start profiling FHIR, you give them Forge or you give them another profiling tool, the first thing that they typically do is, yeah, I don't need that max occur 0, I don't need that max occur 0, and they can strain out all of the different data elements that their particular solution doesn't need. Because why would you want data sitting around exposed in the interface that isn't something that your system actually needs to have? And the problem with that is that what you're really doing is you're customizing the interface to only include the elements that your system needs to have, and saying that if you send anything that I don't need, that's an error. Which then means that every client that needs to talk to you needs to create a custom interface to talk to just your system. If they have, say, patient deceased state, you don't want patient deceased state, and you can strain it out, then they have to create a custom interface to talk to your system that strips out that piece of information. And if all of their other partners do the same thing, then they are creating a separate interface for every single server that they're talking to. And not only are they creating it, but they're maintaining it now and forevermore. And there's a cost to doing that. And Sometimes that cost ends up getting transferred to you, because if they're going to talk to you and they're going to have to pay extra money to create a custom interface, then they're going to find some way of getting compensation for that, either from the server or from the customers that they have, and the community as a whole pays for that. It is legitimate to constrain elements if it truly is an error for that data to be present. So if you have a rule that you don't deal with dead people, that's not something that makes sense for your system to do. For example, if you are a decision support system that's providing guidance on prescribing narcotics, and it doesn't really make sense to prescribe narcotics to dead people, it is legitimate to say that deceased state can't be present. But generally speaking, you want to allow all elements to be present in the interface, and just ignore the ones that you don't care about, because it's free to ignore things. There's no obligation when data comes to you in a FHIR interface that you have to pay attention to every single piece of data that you receive. There are exceptions to that. There are some legal spaces where if you allow data past your front door, you are deemed to have custody of that data and responsibility for that data. And so there might be incentive to prevent data from coming past your front door that you don't recognize or that you don't know how to process. But most of us aren't in that boat. And even if your lawyer's initial reaction is, yeah, don't let it in, make sure that you talk with them and confirm, because quite often there actually isn't a problem to receiving the data and then ignoring it if you're clear about what it is that you support and what you don't. And we have the must support element where you can declare, these are the elements that I'm actually going to pay attention to. Feel free to send me anything you like, but I'm going to ignore anything, at least for now, that's not in this list. Yeah.
I've heard quite a bit of pushback on must support true when it concerns national ID type of things like US core. Is there any difference between what a specific company does with must support versus what a national profile set would do with must support, in your opinion?
So the question is that there's been some pushback against must support for sort of national level profiles, things like US core. Must support means that you have some sense, some agreement on what the business case is for the interface, that you know who's going to be consuming the data, and therefore you can define what are the elements that the system must actually pay attention to. And the challenge with particularly the US core implementation guide is it's serving two different purposes. There is the purpose it was created for, which is defining behavior of electronic health systems, exposing data to comply with US meaningful use regulations. And for that purpose, must support makes pretty good sense in that it's defining these are the elements that the US legislation says you must expose or must be capable of exposing. If you can't, then you don't comply with US regulations. And must support is perfectly appropriate there. But US core has then been extended to here's how we should expose data in the US, period, independent of who's doing it or why. And of course, the assertions about must support in that implementation guide are not going to apply when you start moving outside of that space. So must support does mean that your implementation guide is defined with a specific context, and that people aren't trying to use it outside of that context. And there are some methodology things that we're exploring to let people say, you know, those data structures look really nice. I'd like to reuse those, but I don't want to bring the must support requirements with them. So that's something that we might see as part of our 5. In addition to constraining elements out entirely, so don't give me gender, don't give me deceased date, whatever it is that you don't care about, don't give me patient contacts. The other thing that we often see is people constraining maximum cardinality down to 1. So I only want one patient name, or I only want one patient phone number, or I only want one reason for admission. I can't handle more than that. And it's totally reasonable to only be able to expose a single patient name or to require that there only be one reason for admission. But constraining out and saying that you can't send me more than one means that, again, the system that is creating the interface that talks to you needs to create a custom interface for your system, because if you only want one name and somebody else needs to know both the legal name and the preferred name, i.e. they have to send two, then they can't satisfy that with a single interface. So better practice in that circumstance is to say it's okay to send me as many names as you have, but there needs to be exactly one name that is flagged so that I know that's the name that I care about. Maybe you care about the legal name, maybe you care about the preferred name, and you want a name that is current, so one that has not yet expired. Or maybe you care about what is the name that you were known when you were in grade 5 or something weird and esoteric. You can have that flagged with a specific extension. Obviously, there's going to be a cost to the client systems or to the servers in supporting that extension on the data. But once they support that extension, they can use that same interface for everyone. So they're going to be putting that extension of this is my favorite name from when I was in grade 5 or whatever weird thing it is that you care about. But they can expose that to everyone. The people who don't care, the systems that don't care, can just ignore that extension. It's just one more name in the collection of names, but you can then extract the particular name that you care about and ignore the rest. And so that is a preferred mechanism, because at least then you're still having only one interface rather than having more than one. Oops. Something, yes?
So why is it allowed to change the cardinality of some elements by code specification? It's not
So the question is, why is it allowed to change the cardinality of elements if it's not good practice to do it? The answer is because there are certain circumstances where there are business rules that say that it's not possible for more than one thing to exist. And FHIR needs to allow for that. And the reality is, in some cases, there will also be systems that don't necessarily follow good practice, where they will treat it as an error if there is more than one name present. Or there are systems that are going to document, rather than what they will consume, they will document what it is that they're going to expose. And in that case, I'm only going to ever expose one, and I promise I'm never going to expose more than that. You can set a maximum cardinality. If you want to say, you need to be cautious about that, because if you're talking about what is the interface you're going to expose right now, it may be that right now you'll only expose one, but in the future you might choose to expose more than one. So again, in that circumstance, it's generally best practice to say, could be more than one of these, be prepared for there to be more than one of these, but right now I promise that there's going to be one that looks like this. And not going to make any statements about anything else that might show up, because that's going to prepare your communication partners for what might come. But yeah, there are situations where you can have a business rule that says that there can't be, or that that's just what you're going to expose. It's often also tempting to ask for the element that you care about to be first. So yeah, it's totally fine for you to have multiple codes. You can have SNOMED, you can have ICD-9, you can have ICD-10, but please send mine first, because I'm important, and I want to be able to see the data that I want to see before all of that other stuff that's noise. In CDA and version 3, we had the notion of what is your primary code, and then we had translations. And our thought process was that, well, we've got translations there, which means that you can have one document that satisfies multiple consumers. The problem is that because we had that primary and then we had translations, every profile tended to dictate that their code was in the primary. And so you still ended up producing different documents for each recipient because every recipient would want their code in the primary space. So you would reshuffle which one was the root, even though you weren't actually changing the meaning at all. With FHIR, it's actually not conformant. to enforce expectations on the meaning of sort order if the core specification doesn't declare that. So the core specification does declare meaning in some places. Patient name, the given names have an order, so that the first name appears before their middle names, that kind of thing. But most places order doesn't matter, and your system should not be imposing expectations on order of elements where that order doesn't actually have meaning. Again, if somebody sends you multiple codings, look for the one that you recognize. If you recognize more than one, pick out the one that you like the most. So if you prefer SNOMED because it's more granular, and they send you a SNOMED and an ICD-10 and you understand both, grab the SNOMED, unless there's a flag that says the one that the user originally saw was the ICD-10 code. In that case, maybe that one's closer to the truth, so you can choose that. FHIR gives you the ability to put flags on different repetitions to convey extra meaning in terms of what is preferred, or what did the user see, or what is the code that's required for such and such a profile. You can have extensions that convey those things, so do that rather than relying on order to convey semantics. There's also often a temptation to say that you must send a specific identifier. So you must always send ICD-10 codes, or you must always send SNOMED codes, or you must always send my hospital's medical record number as the identifier. Totally legitimate to say that there must be a SNOMED code or a ICD-10 code, or that the medical record number for your hospital needs to be one of the ones that's present. Just don't set that as the fixed value for identifier.system or coding.system. Allow for the possibility that there can be multiple repetitions, and some of those repetitions will be ones that you don't necessarily care about. It is a little bit of extra work on you as a server to go through a whole collection and find the one that is the one that you want, but that's not exactly a hard exercise to do, and it significantly reduces the costs for the clients because they no longer have to create custom interfaces just for your system. Something that's a little bit more subtle is behavior inquiries. There has been a temptation to impose search filters by default when people ask for data. So if you ask me for patients and you don't specify any filters, I will automatically only give you the active patients, or I will only give you the patients that are alive, on the presumption that that's what most systems care about, and we want to be safe, and we want to not give people data that they might be misinterpreting or doing bad things with. The challenge with that is that if you have systems that actually want everything because they care about deceased patients, or they care about non-active patients, or they care about data that's been entered in error, then you're not giving them an ability to see that. And so they make a presumption that they're seeing the entire picture when they're not. You all can also have systems that will start by exposing a subset of the data, and then over time they start exposing more of it. And if you do not prepare client systems for the fact that, hey, you need to filter by this, right now I might only be giving you a subset of the data, but eventually I'm going to be giving you more. And if you don't start filtering today, then 2 years from now, when I sort of open the floodgates a little bit further and expose more stuff, you're going to be getting data that you don't want. So make sure that you set expectations for filters to be defined, and test that even if your existing data that you're exposing isn't everything, that systems are capable of and prepared to handle all the data that you might be throwing them eventually. Of course, nobody's ever seen this before. FHIR opens up new possibilities. So just because you're used to doing things as documents or as PDFs doesn't necessarily mean that you need to continue to do things that way. I've talked to a number of clients who said that IG publisher is awesome, but can it produce PDF? And yes, we could produce PDF, but we really don't want to because your developers really don't want you to. It is much easier for software developers to have a web-based specification that they can navigate and jump to wherever the heck they want, and where it's not presented in a serial format where people are tempted to print it and kill trees and do nasty things to the environment. So just because you are used to doing things a particular way, think about why FHIR has done what it's done, and make sure that you necessarily need to continue to do things that way. There are some folks with certain governments who say for regulatory purposes it needs to be because the regulation says that it shall be, and in those circumstances you might not have a choice. But other than that, think about it. We have a whole lot of systems out there that do not track provenance, that they do not have detailed records about who created something, why did they create it, what system did it originate from. And it makes sense that they haven't really cared about that much in the past, because all of the data has tended to come from their environment, or it's been isolated off in a separate section. Yes, I accept external data. It all comes in as CDAs, and it all lives over there. But as soon as you start taking allergy information and medication information and encounter information in discrete form and presenting it to your clinicians as an integrated list where they see allergies that were entered into their system locally, but also that came from a regional hospital, and also maybe that came from some other country, imported on an iPhone or whatever, then there's going to be a need for flags that say this data came from elsewhere, and an ability to drill down and see where that data originated from. And you're going to need support for things like provenance to make that happen. Same thing is true for audit event and other types of resources that you might not have historically exposed, but that FHIR now has a standard way of sharing. So you might have a proprietary way of capturing and representing form data because version 2 didn't give you a good mechanism, CDA didn't really give you a good mechanism, FHIR does. So maybe this is an appropriate time to consider, is this something that we want to expose in a standardized way? Are there client systems, are there smart on FHIR apps, or other solutions that could leverage that data and do useful things with it? Last consideration is pay attention to the FHIR community. Graham often says that the FHIR specification is only half on the website. The other half of the FHIR specification lives in the community. We cannot possibly document the rules and the expectations for every single edge case that might show up. If we did, the specification would be 200 times its current size, and nobody would actually read everything that we wrote anyhow, so we still wouldn't get interoperability. It is the people coming to the forums and asking a question and saying, couldn't find a mapping for this particular concept, I'm thinking about defining an extension, is that the right thing to do? And the rest of the community coming back and saying, actually, the right way to capture that is observation. Here's a standard LOINC code for that. Or there is actually an extension defined. It's in that implementation guide over there. Submit a change request and we can add a hyperlink to it or make it more accessible. Or we don't usually use that term. The industry term for that particular concept is this, and here's where you can find it. Or, you know what, that's a really unique concept, and no, we don't have a standard way of doing that, and no, we don't think that we want to add it to the core specification, thanks very much. Custom extension is totally appropriate, good luck. And then perhaps thinking about, nobody else is doing this, why am I special? Is this really necessary? Sometimes you are special and sometimes it is necessary. But having that community feedback about how common is it that what you're trying to do and where should it actually live is important. So please do engage with the community. Chat.fire.org is a very busy community. We can have 200, 300, 400 messages a day sometimes if you're tracking all of the forums. We do not expect everybody to track all of the forums, but if you want to, you certainly are welcome to. I find it fun. But do come in and search when you have a question, when you're not sure. Even if you think you're sure, but you have that niggling doubt at the back of your head of, well, this is going to be easiest for me, but it's not clear from the language in the specification whether it's right, come ask. Worst case is we'll say, you know what, we should probably clarify the language, submit a change request, and we'll get that cleaned up so that it's really clear both to you and to everybody who comes after you that your path is the right path, which means that most other systems are going to end up doing what you're doing and the data will flow. But sometimes we will say, you know what, that really easy thing, that applies in certain circumstances, but not in yours. Here's why. And you will save yourself some pain. Because if you end up trotting a path that is different from everybody else, even though it might technically be conformant and might technically work, it's not going to work with everybody else. And of course, the whole reason that you're using FHIR in the first place is that you want data to flow to other systems and data from other systems to flow into yours. And it's that consistency of behavior, not just technically compliant with the specification, that gets you there. Yeah. Heck with it. So, only 4 primary principles to getting maximum value out of the FHIR specification. Use REST whenever you can. You can't necessarily use it all the time, but you can often use it more than your initial default solution is. Places where you have been doing messaging and documents in the past, you don't necessarily need to do that with FHIR. Second is try to design your interfaces so that whoever is talking to you can create a single interface to talk to you and to everybody else, because that reduces community costs overall and will hopefully result in lower costs to you in the end as well. Just because things used to work that way doesn't necessarily mean that they can work that way or should still work that way with FHIR. So think about how the data is changing, think about how the environment is changing, and what additional data requirements there might be around that. And fourth, tie into the community. If you do those things, your FHIR implementations will tend to realize much more of the power that FHIR offers. You'll get better interoperability, you'll get more widespread interoperability, and you'll get solutions that you can build on top of for many years to come. Summary, try not to be special. Try not to make your system do things differently than everybody else. Yes, it is important that you do things that provide value to your customers, but typically that value is not at the interface level. If your interface behaves differently than everybody else's, that's not generally seen by most of your clients as providing value. That's seen by your clients as being a pain. Provide value in your user interface, provide value in your analysis, provide value in your decision support, but try to make your interfaces as consistent as possible. None of these are one-size-fits-all solutions. There are trade-offs. When you create profiles that say, you know what, totally fine for you to send as many identifiers as you like, but there needs to be one that looks like this, those profiles are not as easy to read as one that says there can only be one identifier. It does take more effort to read and understand, and sometimes to write the code to handle that. But it does mean lower costs in terms of the number of interfaces systems need to maintain. As well, your project managers are not necessarily interested in reducing the costs for the overall community. They're interested in getting things out as quickly as possible and meeting their particular timeline, and if it makes things more expensive for everybody else, too bad for them. They're not footing the bill. That's the reality that we work in. So you won't necessarily always be able to sell this, but try. FHIR is in it for the community. We want healthcare information to flow more freely. And so every time you can make it cheaper for others to integrate with you, it tends to make things better in the long run. And look for who's doing this. If you are finding partners that are following these principles and making it easier for the community at large, then support them and encourage them. And when you find systems that are not doing that, that are doing things in a special way because they feel that their interface needs to be special, then nudge them and encourage them to think about things differently. Questions?
You don't mention anything about not using the resource.id. I find that using ID, enforcing the ID to be used in like an update makes a tight coupling because they either need to store it or search first, etc. So for loose coupling, I think the conditional update and additional create are really great tools to also improve the reusability of the API.
Yeah, so the question is around the use of resource.id and whether referencing that directly versus doing conditional references is better. That depends very much on the way that your environment is set up. If people can query by ID, pointing by ID isn't necessarily problematic. It's a situation where the data doesn't necessarily live in one particular place, but is distributed. That you might want to point by identifier because you don't necessarily know what server they're going to hit to find the information. So if you're in an environment where you know that this is the patient repository or this is the provider repository, pointing by ID isn't necessarily a problem. It's very specific. But if you have multiple provider registries and they might be looking over there or they might be looking over there, then a conditional reference by something like license number or whatever is appropriate. And I've been given the hand wavy signal that I'm not supposed to be talking officially anymore. So I'm happy to stay and talk unofficially, and other people might want to get food. Thank you.